Not too long ago, we took a quick look at the recently released Surface Pro 11 with the Snapdragon X Elite processor from Qualcomm. This time around, I thought it would be interesting to focus in on PC gaming with the Snapdragon X Elite and see how both the Microsoft PRISM translation layer fares in terms of compatibility with x86 PC games, as well as the kind of performance that we can expect with Qualcomm's new Snapdragon X processor. I spent almost 3 weeks testing nearly 40 games for PC, ranging from lighter and beloved indie titles to AAA games with a mixture of both new and older titles to get a good feel of the kind of performance we can expect with a wider range of titles. So before we begin this showcase, I do want to mention a few important tips to get the most performance out of your Snapdragon X device. Now for this showcase, I am specifically using the Surface Pro 11 with the X Elite processor, and it should give us a good idea of what to expect with similar devices. Every game here was tested using the best performance setting for the power mode in the power and battery options. To set your device to use the best performance option, all you need to do is select the battery icon in the bottom right corner of the Windows taskbar. You should have a small window pop up from the taskbar and then click on the battery icon again to bring up the power and battery window. In this window, you can now set the power mode, which is the second option on this screen, and set it to best performance. I will say that in my testing in the past few weeks, the performance options here actually work quite well, but given that this is focused on gaming, we will be sticking to best performance. Now, another area that can be adjusted to maximize performance within Windows is to head on over to the graphics settings. You can actually reach this by staying in this window and utilizing the search bar on the left and just simply typing in graphics, and the first option that appears will be the graphics settings. Scroll down until you see graphics under the related settings section. From here, you can make adjustments to things like auto HDR and whatnot. But most importantly, we can create custom settings on a per game basis. So for example, I have Animal Well here as the first entry in my list. By selecting Animal Well, we have an expanded list of options here. We will want to pay attention to the GPU preference. Now, for the most part, when it's set to let Windows decide, I've found that it works pretty well. But we can override this and specifically tell Windows to use the Snapdragon X's Adreno graphics in a high performance mode to maximize the capabilities of said chip. So now when I launch Animal Well, it will specifically use the high performance option for the Adreno graphics. This can be done for any application, and you can add your own to this list by selecting either the Add Desktop App or the Add Microsoft Store App option. By selecting the Add Desktop App option, all you have to do is point to the directory that contains the exe for the specific game or app you are trying to add, and then you can adjust settings as needed. My goal for this video, as always, is to get the best and most stable performance out of the games, and so that will mean at times that I've set hard caps to the games. The target resolution for the games in this video was 1920 by 1080, but there will be some cases that the resolution will deviate from this baseline. Again, for the sake of obtaining the best and smoothest gameplay possible. I will have all of my settings used displayed on screen for each game here. We are just about ready to get started here, but I figured that we might as well get out of the way games that I felt didn't perform well here or just flat out didn't launch or work, most likely because of compatibility issues with the PRISM translation layer. I'm positive that I will be asked about some of these games, so I still wanted to mention them and give you, the viewer, the answer right off the bat. So on screen is a list of games that I've tested and either don't work or have poor performance. This list includes some viewer requests like Far Cry 6, Mirror's Edge, as well as some personal games that I wanted to try for myself, like Forza Horizon 4 and 5, Halo Infinite, No Man's Sky, and Resident Evil 4. Unfortunately, Wuthering Waves had pretty poor performance, and despite my best efforts adjusting settings, resolution, and utilizing some of the performance tricks, it just wasn't quite there for me, as something I'd consider realistically playable. For Cyberpunk, the game would crash frequently for me, so beyond some benchmarking, I can never actually get in-game with it. I will say that I did manage to get the frame rate above 30 frames per second in Cyberpunk, but again, the game had frequent crashes for me, so hopefully in the future I can revisit that game. So let's start the showcase out with a lighter but fantastic game. Animal Well was released earlier this year, and so it gives us an opportunity to test a new release title in terms of compatibility with PRISM, as well as examine performance here. Animal Well is a Metroidvania style game with absolutely stunning pixel graphics, and it easily captured my attention with its fantastic gameplay and world. For Animal Well, I am set to use 1920 by 1080 with the best graphics option and a 60 frames per second cap, and the Surface Pro 11 with the Snapdragon X Elite has no issues handling the game. I suspect that this will be the case for many of these similar style games on the Surface Pro 11. and definitely will be the types of games to look for when trying to enjoy gaming on this or a similar Snapdragon X device. Art of Rally is a really slick and visually stylish top-down rally racing game that is inspired by the golden age of rally racing. I absolutely adore the minimalistic and low-poly graphic style, which combined with both the gameplay and soundtrack makes this almost a Zen-like experience, much like Fun Selector's first game, Absolute Drift. Similar to Animal, I think this is a game experience that lends itself well to a device like the Surface Pro 11, and here with the Snapdragon X Elite, performance is quite solid. I have the game set to use a resolution of 1920 by 1080, using low quality settings with a 60 frames per second cap, and it's running very well here. I think in terms of visuals, this one is a bit more demanding than Animal, and so it's a good demonstration of a title that requires more of the Snapdragon X Elite, but I promise we will be pushing the Surface Pro 11 much harder as we continue on. I apologize in advance if you haven't heard of our next game, Balatro, which took the world by storm earlier in the year and is an absolutely brilliant poker-themed roguelike deck-building game. I offer my apologies because this game is dangerously addictive, and if you dare to play it, you might find yourself unable to pull away from it since its concept is so compelling that you can't help but play more than just a single round. In fact, Balatro on the Surface Pro 11 is a fantastic fit, since while the game supports a controller, it also supports the touchscreen, and being able to use the Surface tablet with the kickstand makes this one of the funnest ways to play the game. For myself, I became hooked all over again with Balatro, loading it on the Surface Pro 11 for the purpose of this video, and many hours later, I decided to keep this as one of my go-to games on the device. As you can probably tell, Balatro works perfectly here, and it's just one of those games that works really well without being able to tell that this isn't a native ARM game. I opted to showcase this game off camera just to show how brilliant Balatro is with the Surface Pro 11, and any owner should definitely keep it on standby when you need to take a break or two from some productivity. Yes, it's a lighter game, but still such a worthy game to own and enjoy. By the way, this game was sipping on the batteries since I noted that after an hour of playing, the battery percentage was still at 100%. Unsurprisingly, Balatro is running at the Surface Pro 11's native resolution of 2880 by 1920. Okay, it's time to up the ante a little bit with a visually more substantial game. Bioshock Infinite is easily one of the greatest games ever made. Now this will be probably one of the oldest games for this video, coming out back in 2013, but that doesn't take away from this title at all. It just so happens that Infinite is one of my personal favorite entries in the franchise, and unfortunately we haven't seen a new entry in the Bioshock franchise since Infinite. And so this title, along with Bioshock 1 and 2, are well worth exploring on the Snapdragon X Elite. This is a good opportunity to explore compatibility with an older game and see how the PRISM translation layer handles a title from 2013. For this game, I am set to a 1920 by 1080 resolution, using very low settings and a 60 frames per second cap. The game is running mostly well here, with some occasional hiccups, mostly in the area transitions. I do wish I could bump the settings up a little bit visually, but other than that, Bioshock Infinite does have good compatibility, and is playable without any issues that I've personally encountered.
Sure fools. Alright. Still got a girl to find.
Next up, we have the first viewer request with Sid Meier's Civilization 6, and this title doesn't need much of an introduction, being the latest entry in the long-running Civilization franchise, which are turn-based strategy games. I was pretty hopeful for this game based on my experience running other games prior to this, and on the Surface Pro 11 with the Snapdragon X Elite, we can comfortably run this game at the 1920 by 1080 resolution, using medium settings and a 60 frames per second cap. The game is as smooth as it can be without any issues, and I spent a good amount of time in this game becoming completely absorbed by its content. Another cool bonus, especially on a device like the Surface Pro 11, is the ability to play the game without a keyboard, using just a touchscreen, since the game does provide that as an in-game option. And so, between the performance being very solid here, and compatibility being excellent, Civilization 6 is definitely a solid choice. Control is our next entry, and definitely going to be one of the most demanding titles on this list, which comes to us from Remedy Games, developers of fantastic games like the Alan Wake and Max Payne franchises. Control released back in 2019, so while it's not the newest release, it is still quite demanding and a good test of any system. Not only that, but Control just so happens to be a fantastic title that I was completely hooked on, finishing it in the same week that it came out. Like many other Remedy titles, it is a very story-driven game with tons of great elements that come together for a very memorable experience. Control is another game that I was hopeful would be a decent performer here, given that it has solid scaling options. For Control, I am set to our baseline of the 1920 by 1080 resolution, using low settings without any resolution scaling, with a 30 frames per second cap for the smoothest gameplay. The nice thing here is that we do have some room for more performance by utilizing some resolution scaling, but the footage here is not using any, and we are locked at 1080p. I'm actually pretty surprised that it's performing as well as it is here. The gameplay is quite smooth with just some minor stutters that I've seen happen on other configurations, including Intel's Core Ultra and AMD's Ryzen 7840U and Z1 Extreme. Crash Bandicoot: The Insane Trilogy is the next game for our showcase, which features the first 3 Crash Bandicoot games completely remade for modern consoles and PC. This is an incredible remastering of the original PlayStation games that retains the feel and gameplay of those games, but with stunning updated graphics, and for a big Crash fan like me, it's an absolute joy to see a childhood favorite come back to life this way. For the footage, I am showcasing the first game in the trilogy, and I've tested all games using the 1920 by 1080 resolution, with low settings and a 60 frames per second cap, and gameplay and performance is very solid here. There are very occasional stutters in gameplay, but overall the frame pacing is smooth and consistent, and the game doesn't struggle to stay at that 60 frames per second target, and despite the low settings is still a visually beautiful game that for anyone looking to do some gaming with their Surface Pro 11 is well worth checking out. So building off the trilogy, let's now check out the brand new entry in the series with Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time, which is going to be the more demanding title here. Now the results were very interesting with this game, and quite different than what I experienced with the trilogy. Initially I went with the usual 1920 by 1080 resolution, but performance was not where I wanted it. First I tested gameplay with a 60 frames per second cap, and it was unable to reach that frame rate, so I went ahead and did a 30 frames per second cap using RTSS, and the results were not as I expected, like in some other games. There was just something off about how the game played and felt with this 30 frames per second cap, despite holding that frame rate mostly well. I think the game just doesn't work well with the 30 frames per second cap, so I decided to go back and adjust the resolution. First I went with the 1600 by 900, but we were still below that 60 frames per second target, and frame pacing was not great here either. So I figured let's give this one last shot using a resolution of 1280 by 720, which definitely helped us get at that 60 frames per second target, despite dips here and there, and so this is where I settled with Crash 4 in terms of performance. I do think there is some issue with both the translation layer and just the Snapdragon drivers, and I would love to see this improved as I think performance can be better with this game. It's almost impossible for me not to talk about Dave the Diver since it's become one of my more recent favorite games to play. There's so much to love about this game, from the charming visuals, characters, and of course the awesome gameplay, which blends a few different genres, but most importantly, the gameplay loop will have you absolutely hooked from the start. This is another one of those dangerous games to test for me since when I start, it's hard to stop. And yes, like Balatro, I've put several hours into it on the Surface Pro 11. Dave the Diver is a gem of a game that is working quite well here on the Surface Pro 11, and I have the game set to use a resolution of 1920 by 1080 with a 60 frames per second cap, and it is staying locked to that target frame rate. I did experience very minor stutters here and there, but nothing that really stood out to me, and for this game specifically, I put quite a bit of time into it without really any issues. It's definitely a great game to have loaded up on your device if you're in need of a break, but just be warned that you might end up playing longer than expected. Diablo 4 is another fairly new release coming out last year, and of course a very popular game and an even more popular franchise. Diablo 4 is a game that I'm quite familiar with testing on tons of different configurations, and one thing that I've learned with this game is that it does have a lot of scaling options, and so I was hopeful that as long as compatibility was there, performance should be up there as well. For Diablo 4, I went with a 1920 by 1080 resolution using AMD FSR 2 set to performance, and a 60 frames per second cap using the low quality preset, and I was kinda surprised that it was holding the frame rate at 60. The frame times are not as good as I would like with these settings, but I did keep playing with this setup, and honestly it felt pretty solid in person, and so for me personally I do think that this is acceptable for performance. But we're not quite done with the Diablo games, and I wanted to feature Diablo Immortal since it seemed like another solid option to test out here with the X Elite and see how compatibility fares with the translation layer, as well as any anti-cheat methods that Blizzard might be implementing for Diablo Immortal. As you could probably tell by the footage, the game does run without issue on the Surface Pro 11, and given how Diablo 4 performed, I was pretty optimistic for this one. The good news is that Diablo Immortal has plenty of scaling options, and I initially tested the game using the Surface Pro 11's native resolution of 2880 by 1920 with low settings, and it does manage to get pretty close to at least a 60 frames per second target, but the frame pacing was just terrible. So I then went ahead and capped this at 30 frames per second at the native resolution, but it still suffers from the same frame pacing issues. So I went back one more time and then tested at the baseline 1920 by 1080 resolution that I established in the beginning of the video, and I'm not all that surprised that performance essentially more than doubled here, and instead we can target a 120 frames per second cap using low settings. The frame pacing issue has improved here as well, but still not perfect, but it's definitely a lot better than it was before, and at 120 frames per second, utilizing the Surface Pro 11's 120Hz display, the game is quite smooth in person. Now, if you remember from my early look video with the Surface Pro 11 and the Snapdragon X Elite, Doom Eternal had various performance issues, and so since then I've been eager to test out Doom 2016, which is the game that came before Eternal and supports both Vulkan and OpenGL backends. Besides Doom 2016 being a fantastic game, I really want to see how this title fared with the PRISM translation layer, given how things fared with Eternal, and I'm pleasantly surprised since Doom 2016 definitely does a whole lot better, which gives me hope that Doom Eternal can see some things improve in the future. For Doom 2016, I used a 1920 by 1080 resolution with low settings and about a 70% resolution scale to achieve that 60 frames per second target, and it mostly does well here without any graphical issues or weird performance issues that we saw with Doom Eternal. One thing's for sure, it's actually playable, unlike what we saw with Doom Eternal. I did test using the OpenGL backend, but performance was definitely better with Vulkan, and so if you're interested in playing Doom 2016, that is definitely the way to go. Final Fantasy VII Remake is our next game, and much like Crash Bandicoot Trilogy, has been completely remade from its original PlayStation version. I don't think this game needs much of an introduction since it's a remake of one of the most popular games from the PlayStation era. Final Fantasy VII Remake completely overhauls the gameplay mechanics, visuals, and narrative presentation, which helps modernize the entire experience and allows a whole new generation to enjoy the greatness of Final Fantasy VII. I was very interested to test Final Fantasy VII on the Surface Pro 11 since I've had good success with this game on lower end hardware since it does scale down quite well, but still looks visually amazing. For this footage, the game is set to use a 1920 by 1080 resolution, using low settings and a 30 frames per second cap. I was pleasantly surprised that it performed a lot better than expected, and I think with these settings the game is quite playable with the Snapdragon X Elite.
So long.
Let's continue on with a very popular game over in the mobile world. Genshin Impact for most mobile gamers probably doesn't need an introduction, but this is a free-to-play open-world action RPG that draws a lot of inspiration from games like The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. Given that this is a free-to-play game, it does lean on some of those gacha mechanics, but still offers up a fairly substantial experience that doesn't require anything up front. For mobile devices, Genshin is always a good game to use to test performance, and likewise here with the Snapdragon X Elite and the Surface Pro 11 we can do the same. I do think this does show some of the weaknesses of that translation layer, since if we had a native ARM version of Genshin running on here, I think performance would be much better. As usual, I am set to use a 1920 by 1080 resolution, using the lowest settings, a 30 frames per second cap, and a 0.8 resolution scale, and we can see that Genshin, even with these settings, is still pushing the Surface Pro 11 quite hard. Again, I really do think that if we didn't need to deal with the translation layer, this game would be far more performant than what we are seeing here. But I am glad that the game is at least compatible, and it does still run. Hollow Knight is always a game I love to test on a lot of different systems since it's a fantastic game that runs quite well on most configurations, as well as being a game that can run with very low power requirements. If you haven't tried out Hollow Knight, well, then what are you waiting for? Hollow Knight is easily one of the finest indie games that's been released in the past few years, and given that it does run on so many systems, is a game that you must absolutely check out. The good news here is that with the Snapdragon X Elite and the Surface Pro 11, this game is pretty much running without any issues. I have the game set to use a 1920 by 1080 resolution with normal settings, and for fun, I just left things uncapped here. And you can probably see that this is going well beyond 60 frames per second, and honestly, I was pretty hopeful that it would perform well here, so for me, it's not too unexpected. Again, this is as much as looking at performance as well as looking at compatibility with Windows on ARM. Honkai Star Rail is another viewer request, and I think a solid choice to examine here. Personally, I have not played much of Honkai, especially when compared to Genshin Impact, but Honkai Star Rail is a traditional role-playing game, and so it's quite different in terms of gameplay style to Genshin Impact. This is another free-to-play game with gacha mechanics, but plenty of content to enjoy completely free. This is also a much newer release coming out just last year on mobile and PC. I was actually quite surprised by how well Honkai performed here, especially since Genshin was far more demanding with the Snapdragon X Elite. Just like Genshin, Honkai doesn't have any compatibility issues and does run here using the PRISM translation layer. Not only that, but performance is quite solid using the 1920 by 1080 resolution baseline with low settings and a 60 frames per second cap. I think this one is an excellent performer here on the Surface Pro 11, but again, I would love to see a native ARM version, as I think we are leaving performance on the table. Next up, we have another fairly new release. Lies of P came out last year and is a Souls-like action RPG with a narrative that is inspired by the novel The Adventures of Pinocchio. Lies of P was developed by Round 8 with publishing handled by NeoWiz, both South Korean studios known primarily for mobile games designed around the games as a service model. The studios saw Lies of P as an opportunity to expand beyond the mobile game market and create a full-fledged experience which would help diversify both studios' portfolios as well as the South Korean video game industry. I was very impressed by Lies of P both as a game and on a technical level, which impressed me with its scaling options, and I was quite hopeful that things would fare well here with the Snapdragon X Elite and the PRISM translation layer. Unfortunately, I think the translation layer is showing some limitations here, since the frame pacing can be an issue at times. I had to use a resolution of 1600 by 900 for this game to somewhat stabilize the performance using low settings and AMD FSR2 set to the performance option. This game had massive frame pacing issues when the frame rate was capped at 30, and so for this one, my goal was to smooth out performance with a 60 frames per second target in mind. Based on the footage here, you can see that it's certainly playable, but still not perfect, and has frequent stutters, which is a bummer, because this is a game that is usually quite performant even on lower end hardware. Again, the translation layer is certainly showing some of its weaknesses. I always get excited whenever I have an opportunity to talk about and showcase Nier Automata, which is such an awesome action RPG from Square Enix and Platinum Games, the same studio responsible for lots of other favorites of mine like the Bayonetta franchise. Nier is a slightly older PC release, coming out back in 2017 for PC, but it is still such an awesome game that blends different gameplay styles, including shmups, which is one of my favorite genres, as many longtime viewers of the channel know. There's so much to love here, and I promise you the gameplay and story will have you hooked right from the beginning. This is another good test of the PRISM translation layer as well as the capabilities of the Snapdragon X Elite, as the game can be visually demanding, but it is also a slightly older game, so compatibility is definitely a concern. For Nier Automata, I spent a good amount of time trying to settle on settings that I thought provided the smoothest experience overall. For this game, I went with a 1600 by 900 resolution, using low settings and a 30 frames per second cap to help stabilize the frame rate, which does go beyond 30 frames per second, but not quite able to hit or stay at 60 frames per second, and so I do like that 30 frames per second cap for this one. For the most part, performance is quite solid despite the need for this 900p resolution, and I'm just glad the game is playable with Windows on ARM, since this is one of my favorite games, and the more people that can enjoy this one, the better. It's finally time to talk about Red Dead Redemption 2, which is probably going to be the most high-profile game for this showcase, and one I bet many are very interested in seeing how it performs using Microsoft's PRISM translation layer, as well as how the Snapdragon X Elite can handle this one in terms of performance. Like Nier, I spent a good amount of time really trying to dial in settings so we can get the smoothest gameplay possible out of the experience here. To start things off, we do get a dreaded error that was plagued many before with this game related to the Vulkan backend, and even systems with dedicated GPUs running natively on x86 Windows can have the same problem. So I had to first troubleshoot this problem since we need the game to use the DirectX 12 backend, which it does support. Otherwise, you can forget about playing Red Dead Redemption here. I always just love carrying over my day work job to my YouTube hobby, and despite a few attempts at fixing the issue, I couldn't get Red Dead Redemption 2 to load, still getting the same error. So I left it alone for a moment, and of course, like all Windows problems, at some point I restarted my Surface Pro 11, and suddenly I could play Red Dead Redemption 2 using the known troubleshooting method, which I will have linked in the description. Okay, with all of that out of the way, let's talk about the game performance. As you could probably see from the footage, the game is compatible with Windows on ARM using the translation layer, which is definitely a great thing to see. As I mentioned, I did spend a lot of time playing this game, and so I settled on using a 1600 by 900 resolution, using DirectX 12, low settings, and AMD FSR set to performance with a 30 frames per second cap, and it's very clear we are pushing the absolute limits of what we can do here with this combination of the translation layer and the Snapdragon X Elite. Even with these settings, there are times that the frame rate will drop into the 20s, especially when there's a good amount of action on screen. Now, the last way we could possibly squeeze further performance is to drop the resolution down to something like 1280 by 720. Now, obviously, no one should be buying a Surface Pro 11 to play this game, and it's definitely a good example of the limitations here. Again, I do hope that we can see some improvements, but this is going to be about as good as you can get from this game, at least as of right now. Regardless, my channel has always been about pushing the limits here, and it's still pretty fun to see this running despite the performance. Okay, enough of Red Dead Redemption 2, let's talk about a very new release. The Rogue Prince of Persia comes to us from the same development team behind Dead Cells, and when I first saw this announced, I was beyond excited. Many fans know I absolutely adore everything and anything that is related to the Prince of Persia franchise, but I also happen to adore Dead Cells, and so this combination of the two had me very excited. The game is in early access, and so it's not a final product, but what's here is very fun and enjoyable. I love the gameplay and the art style, and I really think this one is going to be something special. The game does work here with the translation layer, and performance isn't an issue. Unfortunately, the game has tons of graphical issues, and I'm going to assume that it has to do with the translation layer, this obviously not being a native ARM game. I'm hopeful that this can be addressed in the future with some updates. So it's time for some Tomb Raider, and first let's check out the last entry in the Survivor trilogy with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This was released back in 2018, and it's still an absolutely gorgeous game. Unlike the prior two games in this trilogy, Shadow of the Tomb Raider was not developed by Crystal Dynamics. Instead, Square Enix Montreal took over to complete the trilogy, which didn't hold it back as Shadow is an excellent game that wraps up this trilogy. A fun fact, this game is actually one of the most expensive games ever made, with an estimated development cost of nearly $135 million. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is another great benchmarking game which has its own benchmark mode, but for this video, let's actually check out some gameplay and see how it performs, which of course has been playing in the background. For this game, I had to go with a resolution of 1600 by 900, using the lowest possible settings and a frame rate cap of 30 frames per second. This is a very demanding game, and even at the lowest settings with this resolution, the game isn't perfect and does have minor stutters here and there. This game also had some weird graphical glitches occasionally, mostly with the shadows. Despite the need for the lowest settings, this game is still pretty nice looking and a fantastic game regardless. The Sims 4 is another viewer request, and another game that doesn't need much of an introduction, being the fourth entry in the long-running Sims franchise. The Sims 4 is a very popular game in the Retro Tech Dad household, and one of my daughters was both excited and confused that I was playing The Sims 4 on my Surface Pro 11. Now, admittedly, my intention was just to test this game, but suddenly I found myself helping my sim along through life's challenges, and before I knew it, time had slipped away from me, which The Sims is a game that is quite good at keeping you occupied. For this game, I went with a 1920 by 1080 resolution, and I am using the low medium graphics quality preset with laptop mode enabled and an uncapped frame rate, and the game is running quite well here, with the settings hitting above 60 frames per second, which means we do have some room for adjustment with the graphic settings. Again, it's good to see that performance is pretty solid and that the game is not having any compatibility issues using the translation layer. Now, we talked about some Crash Bandicoot earlier, and of course we can't forget Spyro the Dragon, and just like Crash Bandicoot, the first 3 games from the PlayStation 1 received the same beautiful remastering treatment. The trilogy is an excellent way to enjoy the Spyro games, and much like the Crash Bandicoot trilogy, well worth playing through for fans of Spyro the Dragon, as well as introducing these great games to a new generation of gamers. So for Spyro, I tested a few different combinations as the game doesn't look quite as nice using the low graphics preset. but with low settings the game can stay locked to 60 frames per second, with just the occasional stutter here and there using the 1920 by 1080 resolution. But this is such a beautiful game when you start to turn off the settings, and using the medium graphics preset, the game is very close to hitting 60 frames per second with these settings, and so you can either cap the frame rate to 30 to help smooth out the gameplay, or tweak some of the medium presets to get slightly better performance. Regardless, the Spyro Trilogy is another set of games that run pretty well with the Snapdragon X Elite, but I do think that the translation layer is holding it back some based on the testing I've personally done here. This next game is one that I personally wanted to test and see how well it run here with the Snapdragon X Elite. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order isn't the newest release, coming out back in 2019, but it's a game I still enjoy to this day and a fun one to load up from time to time. There's also a sequel to this game called Jedi Survivor, but I have not tested that one just yet. Fallen Order has us take on the role of Jedi Padawan Cal Kestis, and for fans of the TV show Shameless, might recognize the actor that portrays Cal. This game takes place 5 years after the events of Star Wars Episode 3 and is an awesome third-person action-adventure game that allows you to make use of all the abilities one would expect a Jedi to have, including force powers and the lightsaber. This is a really top-notch game across the board and well worth checking out, but I'd say for those with a Surface Pro 11 or similar might want to temper their expectations, as this one is definitely pushing the limits hard. Unfortunately, I wasn't too surprised by the results given what I've seen with other demanding games, and so for Fallen Order, I settled on using a 1600 by 900 resolution with a 30 frames per second cap to help stabilize the frame rate, which still isn't quite perfect but certainly playable. Now both Fallen Order and Survivor are pretty notorious for having performance issues, and so another thing I needed to do for this game was to head on over to the INI settings to make further adjustments, since a lot of these options are not available in the game menu and really can help performance quite a bit. I'll have a link to my INI file in case you are interested in trying out Fallen Order on your Snapdragon X device. Streets of Rage 4 is an awesome continuation of the Streets of Rage franchise many years later that really stays true to the gameplay and style of the original games from the Sega Genesis days. Streets of Rage 4 comes to us from .emu, and if you're not familiar with this studio, they are responsible for bringing back quite a few classic franchises like Windjammers and Wonder Boy, as well as being responsible for the very awesome Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge. Streets of Rage 4 is the perfect example of how to bring back a classic and beloved franchise, but modernize it so that a whole new generation of gamers can enjoy it. The visuals are absolutely top-notch here, and of course for beat-em-up fans, the gameplay is equally top-notch. I was pretty hopeful that Streets of Rage 4 would perform well here with the Surface Pro 11, and I have the game set to use a 1920 by 1080 resolution, using ultra graphics, and we are staying essentially locked to that 60 frames per second target. This is definitely a must-play on this device, and it looks so beautiful with the OLED display. We're not quite done with Tomb Raider, and I wanted to see how the older first entry in the Survivor Trilogy would fare with the Surface Pro 11 and Snapdragon X Elite, both for compatibility and to see if the older game would have better performance than Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Despite Tomb Raider 2013 being a fairly old release at this point, this is another great game that has beautiful visuals as well, and for this game, maybe unsurprisingly, it performed a whole lot better than Shadow of the Tomb Raider, with this game being set to a 1920 by 1080 resolution, using normal settings and a 60 frames per second cap, and the performance is very solid, which means that we have some room to adjust visuals as needed for better battery life or perhaps to increase the fidelity. Not only that, but I'd say that this one was very smooth overall, with barely any type of stutter or hiccup in the frame rate and frame times. There's no doubt that The Witcher 3 is one of the most popular games being featured here in this video, and despite it first releasing way back in 2015, this game has still remained incredibly popular, and rightfully so. It also happens to be a game that pushes hardware, and to this day is still a great way to benchmark performance. Now, since I am not featuring CD Projekt Red's more recent game with Cyberpunk, I think that The Witcher 3 is more than worthy to take its place in this showcase video. The Witcher 3 provides plenty of options to tweak settings in all sorts of ways. I will say that it doesn't play well with the Surface Pro 11's native display, since it not only has a weird aspect ratio, but the resolution is obviously going to be far too demanding of the hardware with a game like The Witcher 3. Now, no matter what I did, I couldn't get any resolution beyond 1366 by 768, and to be fair, it probably won't realistically handle resolutions beyond that. For this video, I set the game to use a resolution of 1280 by 720, using the Steam Deck preset for graphics, and initially I had it set to a 60 frames per second cap, but performance was too variable with the 60 FPS cap, and so I went ahead with a 30 frames per second cap, which definitely helps stabilize performance with this game. In my playtime, I did experience a crash with The Witcher 3, but it didn't happen again during my playtesting, and I was able to put a good amount of time into the game without issue. Now this video took me a bit longer to prepare than I was expecting, which isn't all bad since it does mean I was able to check out Zenless Zone Zero, which is a very new release from the same studio that brought us Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail, and yes, like those games, is a free-to-play game. Zenless Zone Zero is an action RPG with an awesome visual style, and personally I've been really enjoying this one, having fun with the gameplay. Of course, this game doesn't shy away from the gacha mechanics, but for right now I've just been playing whatever is available to me as free content, and I think this one is going to be very popular long term. I was pleasantly surprised by how this one performed here on the Surface Pro 11. First of all, the game doesn't have any compatibility issues, so that's great, especially because this is a brand new release and will most likely be a popular free-to-play title. For ZZZ, I went with a 1920 by 1080 resolution, using 0.8 rendering, a 60 frames per second cap, and the low graphics preset. I did go into the low preset and turn off some of the fancier effects for a performance boost. The game, even at low settings and fancier effects turned off, still looks pretty awesome, and it does quite well with these settings staying at 60 frames per second most of the time. It's not perfect with this setup, but I spent a good amount of time playing it like this, and I actually found the experience to be pretty enjoyable. And so we've reached the end of this video, and I do hope that this helps any potential buyers or current owners with a Snapdragon X device to get an idea of what is possible and what to expect with these devices. If there are any other games you're curious about, definitely leave your requests in the comments section, and I will try my best to test them. I'm not quite done yet with my work on the Surface Pro 11 and the Snapdragon X Elite, and I will be back in the future with additional coverage for gaming specific, so definitely stay tuned to the channel. As always, this is the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.